Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We're going to give a few minutes just to let everybody join in and get settled. All right, and while everyone's joining in, I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you all can see it. Welcome to our webinar, The Tribal Edge, Protecting Sovereignty. Sorry, guys, let me start over. Welcome to our webinar, The Tribal Edge, Protecting Sovereignty Through Modern Cybersecurity. My name is Kaylee Kuhn from TribalHub, and I'm thrilled to be here today with the team from Arctiq and Cloudflare. We're going to get started in just a second, but while we are all waiting, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat, where are you all joining us from today? I am currently in our Northern Michigan office where it is 37 degrees and finally sunny. We're getting a nice break away from the snow, and hopefully it will be spring soon. So I'm so excited to see what everybody has to say.
Well, if you're in Northern Michigan, you're getting the same weather. You're getting pretty much the same weather that we get here. I'm in Toronto, everybody, for those who are joining us, and also probably about 35 degrees right now. Although I have not been outside today, so I don't know.
It's a nice break, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's above zero for the first, well, above 32, above freezing for the first time in a month.
Right. Exactly.
Denver, Colorado, sunny and 60 degrees. Absolutely beautiful out.
Very nice. You got to send some of that our way so that we can enjoy that. All right, I'll give a few more minutes, let everybody join in, look in the chat, get settled. And I know that Jason here is also joining from a sunny place. He said that he is in San Diego. So if anybody else is in California, pop in and let us know.
What is the weather like in San Diego today, Jason?
The same as it was in November, is the same it was in April, is the same it was in February. It doesn't change much.
All right.
I don't know how I feel about that. Sorry.
We get one season. Perfect.
Makes it easy for planning purposes. All right. We're going to get started. I think everybody has joined in and gotten settled in. Okay. And special thanks today to our webinar partners, Arctiq and Cloudflare. Our presenters are Jason Gordon and Alex Vulovic, sorry if I butchered that, and also Matthew Boknevitz. You will learn more about them soon. This webinar session will be recorded and you'll be able to review the recording anytime on our TribalHub website. And you'll also receive an email with the link to this webinar. So feel free to share that with anyone on your team that may have missed. And for our third slide, here's a quick look at some of the learning objectives that we'll learn today. Please be sure to use the Q&A or the chat if you have any questions, and we'll make sure to get them answered. And for our fourth and final slide, here's a quick reminder about our regional forums coming up in the next few months. So if you have any questions regarding that, please refer to our website or reach out to me. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor right over to Jason, Alex, and Matt to start presenting.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Gordon. I've been with Arctiq for 18 years. I'm based in San Diego, California, and I'm your single point of contact here at Arctiq. So any follow-up, any questions, any meeting requests, you can just send those to me. I've put my signature in chat, so you have my email address and my phone number. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to kind of hosting the questions today, and then Bach and Alex, they'll go back and forth, and we hope to have a little bit of a volley back and forth, kind of a panelist discussion. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Alex for a quick bio.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Vulovic. I am Principal Solutions Architect, and I lead the Cloud and Application Security practice at Arctiq. I've been with Arctiq now for almost 4 years, nothing like Jason's 18 years, and it's been a wild ride. My primary area of expertise is basically cybersecurity engineering. So going from whether you're hosting stuff on-prem, whether you're hosting stuff in the cloud, whether you're using SaaS products, whether you're talking about mobile devices, whatever it is, how do we knit that together into a secure framework that sort of encompasses everything you're doing rather than treating it as a bunch of point solutions? Pleasure to have this conversation, and I'll just turn it over to Bach.
Hey, my name is Matthew Boknevitz, aka Bach. There was a lot of Matthews in Cloudflare, so I decided going by Bach was a more efficient use of my time. So I've been with Cloudflare for over 2 years now. I work for the public sector team and deal with a lot of our customers who are on the western half of the country. So we're kind of all over the place. I've been in cybersecurity as a career for over 20 years now with a bunch of different companies, including Akamai and Human Security, things like that. So quite a diverse kind of plethora of experience. So I'll kick it back to Jason.
Thanks, Bach. Thanks, Alex. So we're going to get started and we're going to talk a little bit about data sovereignty and regional controls. And I'd like you guys to kind of ponder this question and give us some feedback. So we hear a lot about data sovereignty when speaking with tribal leaders. So how does Cloudflare specifically help a tribe ensure their data stays within US borders and under their own jurisdictional control?
Yeah, so I think there's two key pieces to this. The first is how do you ensure that the metadata about our services exists within the United States? And we have regional services for that. We can restrict where the transaction takes place in terms of the edge networks. We can ensure that the metadata about those transactions stays with the United States as part of our regional services. So as part of Cloudflare for Government, that's all part of a larger package. And the second part is how do we protect your data from getting out from your networks and your locations? And that's where we start to pivot into more of the Cloudflare solutions in and of themselves with things like zero trust, with things like, because we can do zero trust on two different levels. We can do it in transit, where your end users are going out to the internet. Okay, let's figure out how to control that data. And we can do it from a data at rest perspective. So we can do it from a perspective of CASB, where we're looking at your S3, your Google Drive. What data exists in those places, and is that sensitive data that needs to be controlled? So a couple different ways to answer that question.
I think what I might add to that, to what Bach has said, is that one of the challenges that we've historically seen with some of our clients over the years is that they see this gap between on-prem and cloud services as essentially a double-edged sword. Right, my on-prem services I can host wherever I want. If I want to put those servers, if I want to put those servers in a head office, I want to put those servers where I know I can control them. I can do that. But with the cloud services, if I'm running on Azure or I'm going to GCP, it's just hosted in a region. And some of those services are not even regional; they may be international. And so I have no control or very little control over where those services are hosted. And so some of our clients who are very sensitive to those concerns are saying, hey, I can't take advantage of the sort of the widespread connectivity of the cloud anymore. My choices are sort of either I give up that control or I give up the abilities. But I think what we're seeing with Cloudflare is that's not necessarily true. Right? You can host your services on-prem. You continue to maintain those services in areas that you physically control while taking advantage of sort of this globe-spanning edge that allows the services to be widely distributed, gives you the ability to connect to them from anywhere, gives you the ability to sort of tie them in. With ZTNA, with sort of tunnels, you can have the control over the data and the resources physically wherever you want and access them anywhere. Right? And so there's this super powerful advantage to being able to take advantage of Cloudflare's 300 points of presence all across the world, that fast routing that links to that backend, and then keeping that data and those resources where you want them to be. Right? I think that's super powerful.
Okay, you guys touched on some regional services, but I'm curious if you guys could add a little bit around legal protections where sensitive tribal records aren't subject to foreign laws or stored in jurisdictions that don't recognize tribal sovereignty. And then maybe if you could also talk a little bit about compliance and the auditing process for federal grants or healthcare regulations like HIPAA by providing a clear digital map of where the data lives.
Well, why don't I maybe start on the first one of those questions, then maybe Bach, you can jump into some of the more sort of regulatory questions that I think are specific to that. But if we talk about sort of not wanting to move those records overseas, not wanting to store those records maybe outside of our specific jurisdiction, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying about being able to very specifically control where that data is going to be stored. Yes, there's some stuff that's less sensitive that we can put in the cloud. And there's a whole bunch of Cloudflare edge services that are super valuable. You can run anywhere, right? But maybe you don't want that back end data to reside in the cloud. So we're going to use like Hyperdrive, for example. Perfect opportunity to have a Cloudflare technology that says we're going to put the compute at the edge. We're going to run that anywhere you want all across the world so that the processing is fast, it's infinitely scalable, super capable. And then we're going to connect right back to those records that reside in a database we're going to store, we're going to control, we're going to physically have ownership over, and it's going to sit in a building which we know where that location is. Right? And so Cloudflare has those technologies to give you the ability to make sure that those records and that data is not moving around in places that you don't know where it is, you don't have control over it.
Yeah, and to tack onto that with the regulatory and compliance piece of it, Cloudflare currently has a lot of products which are compliant with FedRAMP Moderate. We have that certification. We're in the process and are committing to most of our products being under FedRAMP High. So that process is already kicked off. It's already going. I know the infrastructure is already being built. So when you have that kind of compliance framework, it covers a lot of other stuff. So those kind of controls really do translate to HIPAA controls and other controls across the board. Like for example, CJIS for law enforcement data. Usually when we talk through, okay, are we CJIS compliant? Well, yeah, because we're also FedRAMP compliant, and those have a lot of connections in them.
Thanks, guys. So we're gonna jump into a little bit about sensitive member data and PII. So with the rapid rise of AI, many tribal councils are worried about sensitive member data or PII being harvested by public models. So how does Cloudflare address that?
So the biggest thing that we can help do is if you're using our zero trust product, so your end users have, for example, a work client, and they're accessing public resources. This is where we start to put a layer of DLP, that kind of data leakage protection on zero trust. And we don't just scan every connection and say, hey, look for this. And we do that, but we also look at how it's being ingested by different things. So we'll take a look at, like, for example, a specific AI application like OpenAI, and we'll go, okay, is this going into a prompt? And we'll compare the data that you care about, whether that's PII or things like that, or it's whatever DLP profile you want to define. So you can define what's important to you and what to search for in terms of tribal data. At that point, then we can make that decision to allow that prompt to happen, or we can prevent it before it gets to the open internet. And that model expands not just to AI, but to the world in general in terms of what are you allowed to upload, what are you not allowed to upload. And that's one of the real key controls we have to make sure that tribal data stays tribal data and not public data.
I think the a key point in this is like taking a step back and saying, where do I want my data to reside and how do I want to manage that data? So we sort of mentioned briefly some of that data you want to store in centralized locations. You may want to store that on-prem in a location you control. But obviously people are going to have stuff on their laptops, they're going to have stuff on their phones, right? That's inevitable. That's going to continue happening. You want to make sure that doesn't leak out. And I think the huge advantage of moving towards this sort of zero trust model is that we start tracking and we start thinking about that as one set of entities, one sort of set of unified controls. We sit down and we say, okay, we understand there's data on-prem. How do our users connect to that data in a secure way? How do we make sure we have control over that connectivity and who has access? We understand our users have data on their own machines, whether that's because it's exchanged by email or whether that's because they downloaded it or they're just running Microsoft Word or whatever it is, right? How do we make sure that the data that they're sharing with each other, that they're sharing with the rest of the world, doesn't sort of float out into the world? And I think what we're seeing is organizations saying, hey, what I really want to do is to be able to create a unified control plane over all that data and understand how that works. And the huge advantage, I think, of Cloudflare in particular is being able to say we can put those clients, those work connectors on every device, and suddenly we've got that unified posture management across our entire estate. And what we'll bring to the table with this is sort of how we can roll that out effectively so that you don't have to worry about misconfigured devices and and sort of data leakage. You've got that central basis. We sit down with you and say, okay, let's build those patterns and let's build those controls, make sure you're comfortable with what that looks like, and then you get that sort of expansion across. And I think what people are struggling with sometimes is point solutions. Right? They say to themselves, hey, if I invest in a mobile device management solution and I'm going to have a DLP client that's going to be on my machines, how does that help protect the data that I may have on my servers that are on-prem or whatever that looks like? And the answer is doesn't necessarily, right? What you really want to do is build that sort of unified solution that is effective at protecting all those issues.
And just to build on what Alex is saying, why should your solution that allows you access to your internal resources be different than the solution that allows you access to external resources? They shouldn't be. They should be that single point of control.
Okay, so Bach, you brought up AI tool prompts, and that got me thinking, how does Cloudflare prevent the accidental upload of sensitive documents to public LLMs, ensuring that tribal intellectual property is private?
Yeah, so what we're really doing is twofold. Number one, it's part of the DLP policies we were talking about before, the ability to define, hey, these are sensitive documents. Don't let copies of this out in the wild. Sometimes it's about building those regex profiles and going, oh, these are the type of patterns that if I see this, those are sensitive. And then tying that to the individual controls over applications. Because when we talk about the zero trust controls for people accessing different applications on the internet, yeah, we can go ahead and block content categories and security categories and things like that. But where the real power comes in is the ability to allow you to go use, for example, OpenAI. And within those controls define, yes, I'm allowed to make a prompt as long as it doesn't run afoul of these DLP profiles, and I can still use that tool. And if I, for example, you get a prompt and get some response back, and that response has sensitive data in it, I can block that response too. And so it's a matter of defining the things that you care about and simply being able to go, okay, it's fine here and not here. For example, Cloudflare uses a lot of Gemini, and that's the tool we're allowed to use. So allowing it in one tool and not in another is kind of just slowly defining and ratcheting down control over that data that exists.
And here's another great example of that, right? So Cloudflare has something called like tenant control. And the idea of tenant control is saying, hey, maybe I have corporate specific resources that I want people to be able to use. So I have a corporate ChatGPT account, right? And we have a specific agreement with ChatGPT that says you're not going to retain or you're not going to process my data, right? We have done that. But some of my folks are using corporate Gemini or they're using Copilot on their personal accounts, and I don't want them to do that. Or even if they have a personal ChatGPT account where those data protection controls don't apply the same way, how is ChatGPT going to know? The answer is they're not. I want to make sure that they're only talking to my corporate account, right? Especially if you're on shared devices, especially if you're on a bring your own device network or something like that. We all know users tend to mix personal and private business on their own devices, right? How we can control that to that level of specificity as well. We can say, hey, listen, we're only going to allow you to talk to your corporate ChatGPT tenant. We're not going to allow you to talk to your personal ChatGPT tenant. And it's those kind of super granular controls that let you build restrictions that are less frustrating to users, I think is one thing. Because otherwise you start blocking just by wide swaths and people are unhappy about that. But also they're more satisfactory from a control perspective. You really are only controlling what you want to control. I think that's sort of the value of being able to sit down with those granular controls.
Thanks, guys. We're going to pivot here. Bach, you've brought up zero trust a couple times. So we're going to pivot towards zero trust and preventing shadow IT. So the question I have for you guys is, how does a zero trust approach help a tribal government manage employees who may be accessing services from remote parts of the reservation or while traveling?
So I think the most important point to think about with the zero trust is you're really tying access to identity and not just a specific network location. When you think about zero trust and any given interaction with a VPN replacement solution or a secure web gateway, the key is that each and every transaction should be tied to identity, not just the initial connection. And so when you have zero trust, it's important that we're able to granularly define based off identity which specific resources they get, whether that's from a content perspective of you're allowed to see these types of sites, to the AI examples we were using before, to hey, you're allowed to access this specific port and protocol in the inside network, but nothing else. Those are the kind of instances where we tie identity and device posture to access as opposed to I'm going to log in with the VPN and here's the network. And when we talk about remote tribal areas and getting those guys access, the key thing is that Cloudflare's global network puts points of presence near them. So number one, the solution is more performant because they're connecting to something that's close to them. And number two, we're treating everything as untrusted. So whether you are in a remote location or at your data center, we're able to apply the same set of granular controls regardless of where you are.
Yeah, and I think when we think about sort of zero trust at a high level, right? The move towards, I mean, companies have been thinking about moving to remote workers, and we're seeing the rise of remote work, but we all know there have been organizations and groups like tribes where not necessarily remote work, but people's like distributed work has been super common, right? And in the past, the security plays for distributed work have tended to rely on hardware, right? We've got a physical box that we're putting in a remote office or we're putting in a building, and now suddenly we've got to invest if we're going to do like an SD-WAN solution, we're going to invest in hardware that we've now got to widely deploy and has a high capital cost. Or we're relying on sort of these VPN solutions and VPN concentrators. And, we've got to deploy hardware on site, but now we've got to bounce back to our local network, which may also not necessarily be on a high quality internet connection, or it may be in a sort of a more remote area. And so suddenly we're hairpinning and it just becomes more complicated. Right. I think one of the big advantages of sort of modern zero trust solutions and Cloudflare specifically is it's primarily going to be software based, right? You're going to run this on the endpoint. The whole idea behind the zero trust and behind it being identity based is it's going to run on the device. We're not going to deploy. We're not going to deploy device. We're not going to deploy hardware all across the region. That doesn't make sense. From a cost perspective, it doesn't make sense. But from an identity management perspective, it doesn't make sense either. And then rather than having a hairpin that back into an environment, again, that may not necessarily have great connectivity, we can run those posture checks in the cloud as close to the user as possible. And the big advantage of doing that is that, yeah, if they're accessing tribal resources that are on-prem, we've got to go back there. But if we're not, we're accessing a SaaS platform, which we've already agreed we're comfortable with, we can just go directly from Cloudflare to there. Right? We don't have to worry about sort of latency and connectivity issues with hairpinning. And if we're just talking to the internet, again, it's going right through Cloudflare's global edge, which is sort of highly performant. So the huge advantage is to not having to invest in those big sort of heavy and expensive hardware deployments on these edge locations, but also performance issues. Like there's a huge performance benefit not having to do that.
So you guys both talked about identity first access. You guys talked about eliminating legacy VPNs, and you talked about granular control. I'd like to unpack this a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about granular control? Let's say you have a healthcare worker accessing patient files. How do you restrict them from accidentally giving them access to gaming financial systems, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess I could start with this, but one of the biggest advantages of zero trust is we can manage things by like an identity level, right? So we can manage things by a particular user. What does that person have access to? We can also manage them by device posture. So we can say, for example, that we only want devices, certain kinds of devices or devices that have specific controls in place. Healthcare records, perfect example, right? We want to make sure that the only people who can access those healthcare records are ones who have encrypted hard disks on their laptops, right? We don't want those. We don't want a situation. I mean, we've all heard of this. We don't want a situation where you download some records, you lose your laptop, you leave it in a cafe or whatever. Somebody finds it and suddenly they've got all this patient data. We don't want that to happen. So we can put posture controls in place and make sure that we've got access only on posture controlled devices. And then we can also make sure that unlike sort of old style traditional VPN solutions, it's not just once you log in, you have access to the entire network and you can do whatever you want as if you were sitting in an office. We don't want that. And it leads to exactly the same kind of situation that you're talking about. So what we can do is we can put connectors directly on every application server if we want. We can, in fact, restrict controls to very specific applications. Even if we don't necessarily put those connectors on every server, we can build the controls in the control plane that says, hey, listen, you can only access this particular device, right? You can only access this particular application. So the biggest advantage of this zero trust model, where by default, a user can't access anything, even if they're authenticated, even if they're logged in, they can't access anything by default. We have to positively give them access to a specific application or device or service, and we can impose these restrictions. It reduces the blast radius. It reduces the potential that somebody either accidentally or intentionally gets access to something they shouldn't have, loses that data, or allows it to escape, again, intentionally or not. Just reduces the risk of those kind of things happening.
And what I'll add is that, we're talking a lot about defining all this identity and all these applications and the specific access, and that's a journey. Like you don't start off with, oh, everything is defined and we're just going to put it in place, right? You start off with where are you today and how do we get to the place we want to go in terms of those controls? And the nice thing about a Cloudflare Zero Trust or other platforms like that is the ability to go, okay, we'll start out with a little bit looser set, and we can build and iterate over time to get better and better and better at this. So it doesn't have to be a all or nothing push into every single thing as granular. You can build these out over time and make it part of a process of continually improving and continually iterating and continually building.
Right. And I think, and sort of just to build on that, one of the things we've seen with customers in the past and clients is sitting down and saying, okay, I want to replace my traditional VPN concentrators, right? They're coming up for renewal in terms of hardware. I don't want to invest in a bunch of hardware. I want to get rid of the client site, like multiple site situations, but I'm not ready to move to a full ZTNA solution where I've got per application posture controls. That's fine. You don't have to do that. You can take advantage of the edge to just and the on-device agents to just give everybody access like you would with a traditional VPN concentrator. And you can then layer on those controls based on level of severity, based on your own criticality, based on how you approach that problem. And that's extremely common as a migration path, but also as having a strategy towards what am I trying to protect? How am I trying to protect it? How do I prioritize that protection and deliver that protection as quickly as possible?
And I'll just add on to that. This is where I think it's so important that Cloudflare works with our partners like Arctiq. Like that is where we find them delivering so much value to the customers we all work with is bringing that level of, okay, here's the process. Be with us through the journey and not just a one-off thing.
And I think like you can one of the big advantages of working with a group like Arctiq is we do that sort of attack path assessment with you when we go to implement something like zero trust. It's sitting down and saying, okay, let's understand your environment. Let's understand the risks that you're worried about facing. This is what we've seen with other customers in a similar position, right? We worked with other tribes. We worked with other state, local education groups. These are the problems they've been facing. This is how they've met those challenges. This is what they've done to protect their resources. By the way, have you thought about this particular threat? Maybe this is something you haven't faced before, but we've seen elsewhere. right? So bringing that ability to say, this is what you really should be, this is the best, most effective way to deliver this kind of solution. And here's where maybe you can push that out another 6 months or 12 months, or you can come at it a different way. It's learning from our customers and being able to take, the challenges they've faced, being able to sort of disseminate that knowledge to other customers and say, listen, this is what other folks are doing, right? Being able to share that knowledge is super valuable.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about shadow IT real quick. A few questions for you guys. First of all, what is shadow IT in 2026? What does that mean for tribal enterprises? What are the hidden risks? What does full visibility look like? And if you could talk a little bit about proactive blocking.
Sure. I mean, the shadow IT is a fascinating thing because I think what we're seeing in 2026 around shadow IT in particular is, and I see this a ton, is vibe coding, right? We've always had shadow IT. We've always had this idea that sometimes IT governance was too expensive or too complicated or too difficult, or it just felt like a pain for people in different departments, people in different groups, everybody. And so they would spin up their own resources, right? Whether those are servers that sits in somebody's basement, whether it's a private account in the cloud, you name it, they ended up doing it. What we're seeing today, though, and this is so funny to me, is instead of somebody who was saying, hey, it'd be really great if I could have access to that, but IT won't give it to me, let me go buy a SaaS account. They're being like, what if I just ask ChatGPT to write it for me, but I can have my own application? And that's really cool. There's a lot of stuff that we're seeing around that that's really interesting. But the huge risk that we're seeing is that if you're using ChatGPT to vibe code an application, a lot of the time there's not a sort of a deep security mindset that's going into the construction of those applications. And so, even at very large enterprises and across the sort of the spectrum, we're seeing these applications come out, and people start running stuff, and nobody knows what's happening, and data is flying everywhere, right? Especially if that's becoming publicly available. And so, the huge advantage of ZTNA when it comes to sort of managing that shadow IT is, one, it's visibility, right? It's saying we understand what's leaving that device. We understand where that data is going. We understand what's coming into that device. We have that visibility. We can visualize it. And then the second piece is being able to say, and now I can control it. Like we talked about data loss protection. We talked about sort of tenant management. We talked about all those things. But it's being able to say, I have strong visibility and I can take action, right? Whether that's human action and administrative action and, going out there and saying, hey, by the way, maybe we need to think about how we bring this back under control. Or did you know that we have a corporate ChatGPT account you can use? Because sometimes it's just a knowledge question, all the way through to saying, hey, we're going to stop people from emailing or uploading or whatever they're doing with those files because we want to control that. So it's really an interesting time for shadow IT, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just say again what Alex was saying. The visibility, I think, is the thing that really gets to a lot of customers and go, oh, this is really happening. Because now you can quantify it. Now you can take this and go, hey, let's associate this with a real risk to my organization and be able to make that direct connection and go, hey, I have a justified need for this thing because here is the definitive proof that if I don't control it, here's how it's going to go. So that risk management piece can really drive into that as well with that visibility.
So related to proactive blocking, let's say you have a leaky application or a high risk application that could potentially be a liability or a vector for a data breach. Can you talk a little bit about how Claire protects leaky applications before they become a liability?
When you look at a lot of the AI stuff, we talked a little bit about this already, but what we see customers doing a lot is going, you can use this AI and none other. And when you try to use this AI, we're just going to literally redirect you. So we're just going to stop you from the beginning from being able to touch those kinds of applications. And that's usually a more proactive approach to fixing kind of the leaky application piece. And then for the things that aren't as clearly defined, like AI apps are a little more clear in their motivation. But when you get into the things that aren't, that's where you start to rely more on the DLP controls and the things like that.
Okay. All right, we're going to switch gears. Thank you guys for talking about Zero Trust and Shadow IT. We're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about resiliency and revenue protection. So, question for you guys. Gaming revenue funds critical community services from healthcare to education. How does Cloudflare's network ensure the lights stay on for vital revenue streams?
So I think the most important thing to look at is we look at ourselves as critical infrastructure. When we have a problem, people notice, and we hold ourselves to a very high standard in both how we develop our network and how we execute it. And so our network is really built along the core of resilience. And the way we do that is by our Anycast architecture. The goal is that if something goes wrong in one place, the customer should not notice. They should just get routed to the next place in line. And because we run all our services everywhere, all our different locations are capable of picking up the ball when something will inevitably go sideways. And so our entire architecture is built on Anycast and resilience from the get-go. So that's really where we start to look at that picture.
And I think one of the things about resiliency in particular is understanding what it means to be resilient and what your risk tolerance around resiliency is, right? We have customers who are using Cloudflare for load balancing across multi-cloud solutions. So if you have multiple data centers and your level of resiliency is, I need physical separation for multiple hot hardware configure or multiple hot standby configurations, you can use Cloudflare for load balancing to seamlessly transition between those, right? We've had customers who went from using a DNS-based load balancing, where it's pretty resilient, it's pretty effective at load balancing, to Cloudflare sort of origin load balancing on layer 3, layer 4, and like getting seamless resiliency. Alternatively, what we've had customers do is say, hey, I'm prepared to move some services into the Cloudflare edge, right? Where I've got 330 data centers now that support those services. They run on any data center across the globe, and resiliency is, half the world could be disconnected and I can still get service in the other half. But it really is a question of sitting down and saying, what are we prepared to do and what does that look like and how can we most cost effectively and securely deliver that? Because all clients have slightly different requirements. If you're under sort of a very particular regulatory regime that you're concerned about, say you're FedRAMP high, right, or you want to make something equivalent to FedRAMP high, that's one set of challenges. And if you're talking about gaming services in particular, right, there may be very specific restrictions that you want to meet based on your particular requirements. We've seen this in the past. Where there's strong geographic localization considerations. I need a physical data center and it needs to be on site. How am I going to make that resilient? Well, unless I've got a second data center somewhere else, what am I going to do to sort of protect that resiliency? So it can be a challenge, but there's flexible and creative ways to work around that. Maybe I move offsite, or I make more flexible things that are not less business critical, but less information critical. Right? Maybe I move some patron services information offsite, because that's not necessarily information critical, or things like that.
And another thing we can talk about a little bit is resilience from an attack perspective. Because when you look at a Cloudflare solution and you're protecting against DDoS and other attacks, the most interesting part about how Cloudflare becomes resilient in and of itself is that we deal with the attack from where the attacker is, not necessarily where the destination is. So if I have a massive 2 million entity botnet that's distributed across the globe, well, the entities in South America, they're going to attack a Cloudflare instance in South America. The entities in Europe are going to attack the Cloudflare POP in Europe. And so we can address these very large scale attacks because we address them in a very distributed manner. And so when we talk about resilience, you have a lot of solution providers that don't necessarily have that architecture, who get focused in some key locations geographically. Whereas Cloudflare, from a resilience standpoint, when we talk about attacks at that level, we're able to absorb larger attacks because of the nature of that architecture.
And here's maybe a practical example of how that kind of thing works. We had a client a while back in the gaming industry, and they had a very specific restriction that said, "Hey, I've got a host from every state where I'm doing business. I need to host." Right. So if I'm doing business in Montana, I'm doing business in Illinois, I need to have those services hosted in that particular state. Now, the downside of doing that is they could use shared hosting, they could use Equinix or somebody else. But because of the scale required, right, you're not going to deploy a huge stack at every site. That's not cost effective for anybody. And if the result is that we got to do that filtering, we got to manage attacks on that stack, suddenly my requirements go up enormously. What I need to do to protect that is very expensive. Instead, what we can do is we can deploy through Cloudflare, and suddenly what we have is, as Bach's saying, the POP is right next to the connector, right next to that attacker. They're going to get blocked there. And then all those resources behind, I can load balance between, I can do connectivity balancing between all those resources located in every individual state. And I don't need to worry about one of those resources being overwhelmed by an attack, right? That's just not required. So I can save money, I can save time, I can save effort. Those can be smaller, easier, more lightweight stacks. Without sacrificing anything in terms of reliability. And that lets me do more interesting things. Maybe I'm going to deploy to more than one data center in a state now that I know I only need to deploy a couple of nodes in that data center rather than 20 or 30. So now I do have geographical redundancy. Now the ability to load balance in the cloud for Cloudflare to be able to say, hey, that's healthy, that site's healthy, or that site's down, means I do have that split that I could never have done before. So moving that sort of control plane and that attack absorption plane, so to speak, to the front, to that edge, is super valuable in our ability to build resiliency in other ways.
Alex, you brought up reliability, and I'm glad you did because I want to circle back to the question I originally had around revenue protection and security. So in the digital age, offline usually means closed. So how does Cloudflare provide that 24 by 7 reliability required to protect a tribe's primary economic engine?
Well, I think so. When we think about sort of 24/7 resiliency, there's in my mind anyway, there's two ways in which you lose in which resiliency is jeopardized, right? One is that there's a security incident. Right? And that can be one of a couple of different kinds of incidents. It can be something as sort of blunt as a DDoS attack, saying, hey, I'm going to deny access to users. Two, it can be as targeted as a very specific attack and saying, hey, my application suffered from an attack like Log4j, and now that's being exploited by somebody to take down the system. And Cloudflare has a couple of super valuable functions there, right? So one is that we've talked about the number of POPs and the capacity of the POPs to absorb something like a DDoS attack. But the other is when we talk to IT organizations, many of them don't have the resources to have a full-time group of IT professionals who are just managing their firewall solutions. Now, Cloudflare, Arctiq does manage firewalls for our customers. So it's very possible that you can go to a third-party provider and say, hey, I'd like you to manage it. But Cloudflare also offers like a managed rule set, which is sort of dynamically updated with these new kinds of attacks, which are updated out of band. So even if your firewall is not being managed by a third-party provider like Arctiq, you can use the managed rule set and you'll get some protection against these out-of-band attacks. And so from from like a security resiliency perspective, you protect yourself right away, right? You get that protection. And then there's sort of the resiliency from a downtime perspective. And I talked about this very briefly in the context of, hey, can I spread across multiple data centers? And yeah, Cloudflare gives me the ability to do that more effectively. And now if there's a wire cut, for example, or there's a power outage, I've got multiple sites that I can be resilient against, and I'm load balancing across those sites effectively. Right? So I'm seamlessly maintaining that uptime.
And the other thing I'll mention is Cloudflare sees so much traffic on a day-to-day basis. So much goes through our network. And so we have the ability based off that traffic to identify attacks and patterns earlier than a lot of other folks. and we use our machine learning and our various tools internally to really understand those attack profiles so we can get ahead of the curve. So we're not purely in a reactive, oh, I see this, let's block it mode. We can usually see kind of what domains are being scanned, how things are currently being exploited, how quickly we need to turn around these kind of solutions. And like Log4j and the SharePoint vulnerability, yeah, we're going to get on top of those as quickly as possible.
So I'd like to peel the onion just a little bit further, guys. Specific to tribal country. Many tribes face geographic challenges, as you guys know, with internet stability. How does the Cloudflare US network presence help overcome those last mile connectivity issues that we're seeing?
I think it's important to note, like, we do have the sheer volume of POPs across the United States. And odds are good that your tribe or organization is going to be close to a few of them. The other point of it is something I kind of mentioned before, where all our services run everywhere. So when we talk about whether we're talking about application security services or we're talking about zero trust, all the POPs are going to support those. And when that happens, it's it's better than a lot of other vendors because other vendors will consolidate. Hey, I may have 50 data centers across the US, but these 20 do this service and these 30 do this service, and this one overlaps here. Whereas Cloudflare, as long as you're close to a Cloudflare POP, you're gonna get that performant service. And that's really how we address a lot of those issues.
Okay, thank you. Alex, did you want to weigh in here, or do you want me to move on to the next pillar?
No, I think Bach covered it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to shift gears once more. We're going to talk about this concept of a
Actually,
seven
sorry.
generation.
Sorry, Jason. I didn't want to. I just looking at the time. I want to make sure if there are any questions that have come up, we get a chance to answer them before. So I like happy to move on. But if you're in the audience and you do have a question and it hasn't been asked, I just want to make sure we have a chance to answer that before we run out of time. I know we've got only not too many more minutes. So
Yes, thank you. So again, I want to briefly, I want to talk about this concept of a seven generation IT. And let's make this one quick. So what does it mean to build a technology stack that serves the tribes for decades, not just the next budget cycle?
Alex, if you want to try that one.
yeah. So one of the things that I when I think about sustainability, and I talk to customers about sort of what does it mean to sort of build sustainable IT practices. One of the things that we talk about is hardware sustainability, right? And how do we reduce the need to buy additional hardware? And one of the reasons customers want to move towards a software-based solution is the ability to sort of reduce the need to generate e-waste and reduce the need to generate additional hardware. And so I think there's sort of a sustainability argument there. I think sort of in a broader context, what we're talking about is the concept of ownership, right? Sustainability often boils down to this idea that I don't want to hand everything off to somebody else. I don't want to make it somebody else's problem. I don't want to give somebody else ownership over it. I want to make sure that it's living with me and it's going to live with me into the future. And I think one of the biggest advantages that we see with Cloudflare is that it is this idea of I've got my own backend I'm going to connect to. I've got my own cloud environment that I'm going to connect to. I can manage that. If I want to deploy resources to the Cloudflare edge directly, I can do that using very standard technologies, right? I can deploy TypeScript. I can deploy containers. Doesn't have to be customized to Cloudflare particularly. I can just deploy stuff that I've already got and I've already built. I don't have to worry about this idea that I'm making it somebody else's problem or somebody else is going to own it. I can continue to manage it. I can put the Cloudflare Warp client on devices that I already have, and I can tie that vision into I can tie Cloudflare into the vision that I have going forward for the next 10 years, 7 years, however many years that looks like.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that and simply say that when we look at Cloudflare as a platform, you see Cloudflare have a high level of innovation and development and pushing out features and evolving with current and future threats. And so when you look at Cloudflare as a platform, you have this ever increasing feature set that you have the option to leverage. Because once you start onboarding onto Cloudflare, it becomes kind of a journey of like, oh, you did this. Oh, we like this too. Let's do this too. And you start to do solution and another solution, another solution. Well, that applies to solutions we haven't even figured out yet, or features that haven't been developed in the marketplace yet. And since you're already on this platform that can really be dynamically built as we move forward, you're kind of putting yourself in a position where, oh yeah, I'm sure Cloudflare will build that when that becomes a relevant piece of technology. And so not only that, you're not having to buy the hardware to update to a brand new feature set, to update to do that. Cloudflare is doing all that maintenance. You're not bringing Cloudflare down for maintenance at any point in time. So that can be helpful too.
Okay. Bach, thank you. You kind of gave me a good segue into the next portion. I want to use the last 10 minutes of the webinar to talk about the Arctiq Cloudflare partnership and moving forward, what the customer might need or want or look into. So briefly, I've got two questions for you guys. Why is the partnership between Arctiq and Cloudflare specifically valuable for a tribe compared to just buying software off the shelf? And then my second question is if a tribal leader is listening and wants to take the first step towards the seventh generation vision, where should they start?
So
Okay.
I'll start with just kind of the context. Like Cloudflare is providing kind of the engine of the technology engine that's there, and then Arctic is really great at being the mechanic who knows how to tweak the knobs and tune it up and make that have that conversation between you as the driver and your car, right? So what we see is we really want we see a big value in Arctic coming in and having that domain expertise in Cloudflare to know how Cloudflare works, to know how to build solutions successfully out for our customers.
Think one of the great things about Cloudflare that we've experienced is, and if you've ever used Cloudflare before, you know this. The free plan is really great. Like Cloudflare's business model has historically been like get the IT folks interested with a very generous sort of free plan. They can play, they can explore, they can sort of, and they become familiar with the product stack. And I think one of the reasons that Arctic is so passionate about our Cloudflare partnership is because what that really does is it says to the customers, hey, you're seeing value because the reason you're interested is it's something you've already experimented with, right? And what we bring in is, hey, yes, we have Cloudflare domain expertise, but we can offer you a bunch of options that may suit whatever shape you're fitting into. We have customers who have managed ZTNA solutions. We have customers who have managed WAF, right? They're sitting down and they're saying, hey, I don't necessarily have the skills today to manage this firewall. I'd like to develop those in the future, or maybe it's not something that I had before. I want to develop those. Or they're saying, hey, listen, I've got a bunch of different environments and I'd like to knit them together. And Cloudflare can help me do that, but I need a little bit of guidance to sort of how does that help? Or I need automation that allows us to sort of roll that out very quickly and deploy that very effectively. Arctic's services strategy has always been very simple, right? It is automate to accelerate. It is saying we want to be in and out from a professional services perspective as quickly as possible. We want to use the automation that we've developed in the past and that we're working with. We want to use it to deploy something very quickly. We want to give that to you, the customer, so that you can continue to use it when we're gone. As like from my perspective, from my team's perspective, if we are in and out the door in 8 or 12 weeks, that's a win. That says to us that we taught you to fish. you're comfortable maintaining it, that we gave you some automation technology that you can use to continuously maintain and tweak and sustain for the next year, 2 years, 5 years, however long that is. And I know that if we do a good job, you'll call us again, right? You'll pick up the phone and say, I'm doing something else. You guys did a great job. Can you help me with that other project that I've got going on, right? I don't see the need to stick around for 2 years on the same project in the hope that would keep getting paid. I know that if I do a good job in 8 weeks, you'll call me back. And so I want to be there as little as possible, right? I want to get in and out as little as possible. Yeah. Jason, I think we may have skipped the second question. I think we may have missed the second question in answering the first. What was the second question?
The second question is really just how we get started. What would be, maybe a logical next step? Maybe do we have risk assessments, visibility audits? Do we start small and scale up? Do we start with member portals or gaming sites? Like, what would be a traditional next step?
I think so. There's a bunch of different ways you could approach it. And I think the first thing is really that initial conversation. Let's talk about what is most important to you and your current setup. And then we can pivot to a lot of different conversations. Sometimes that's infrastructure related, and we do an assessment around application security. Sometimes it's really about the data sovereignty questions we have with zero trust, and we have a conversation with that. But we see different customers approach this in different ways depending on what they really need. Often it's DNS and WAF. Sometimes it ends up being email security or zero trust. So it's really about having that initial conversation, and because these conversations really need to be more about you as tribal organizations than it is about Cloudflare and our fancy widgets and shiny toys. Like it needs to be about how we can help you get to where you need to go and getting you the right solution for that.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. You guys have been great. I've put my contact information in chat. Please reach out to me if you want to follow up with getting a meeting on the calendar with Bok or Alex. If there's any questions, Kaylee, that we can address, I think we've wrapped up our webinar part.
Fantastic. I do not see any other questions. I dropped everybody's contact info in there in case there was any, if people wanted to reach out after our webinar. But thank you, Jason, Alex, and Matt, for all sharing your insights. If anyone would like to get a hold of them, please reach out to us at tribalhub.com. We'll make sure to keep you connected. Also, look for our email tomorrow, and please share that webinar link with anyone on your team that may have missed today. And with that being said, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm wishing you all a very productive rest of your day, and we'll catch you on the next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.